Can you believe the darkest secret hidden within the ruins of the Roman Empire, the unshakable truth buried beneath the shattered marble of Athens? It's a story not of conquering armies, but of men who stared down the abyss of history and simply refused to blink. This is the untold saga of a weapon more potent than any legion, an armor stronger than mithril, forged not in fire and blood, but in the deepest, most terrifying stillness of the human mind. We are talking about epochs soaked in betrayal, generations ravaged by pandemics that wiped out half the known world, and imperial courts where one misplaced whisper meant instant, agonizing execution. This was the terrifying, blood-soaked stage upon which they walked. Imagine the world collapsing around you. The sky is choked with the smoke of burning libraries. Your greatest leaders are poisoning their own families. And a plague, a catastrophic Black Death no one saw coming, is consuming every major city, from Alexandria to the Danube.
Total, unforgiving annihilation was not a possibility. It was the daily forecast. Yet, in the eye of this hurricane of historical horror, there were men, ragged, often poor, frequently despised, who possessed something absolutely lethal to chaos itself. They possessed absolute calm. They didn't conquer the world with swords. They conquered the world by conquering their own fear. They achieved a level of mental fortitude that allowed them to watch their entire civilization crumble, yet remain utterly, terrifyingly serene.
These were the ancient philosophers, and their wisdom wasn't just a quaint academic pursuit. It was the ultimate survival guide, the forbidden blueprint for psychological invincibility, and the key to defying death itself. We are going back, deep into the suffocating humidity of the Hellenistic period, where the colossal dream of Alexander the Great had violently disintegrated, leaving behind a power vacuum filled by backstabbing generals and endless, brutal civil wars. The great cities were bloated with refugees, and starvation was a constant companion. The average lifespan was a brutal 25 years, and tomorrow was a promise rarely kept. Life was cheap, and suffering was the currency of the day. In this unforgiving furnace, the intellectual titans emerged, not from palaces, but from the muddy streets and dusty marketplaces. They watched the madness unfolding, the ceaseless slaughter, the corruption that ate away at the soul of the republics, the sheer, idiotic waste of human potential. And they asked the most dangerous question imaginable. How do you live a good life when the world is designed to make you suffer? How do you maintain sanity when tyranny holds a knife to your throat and fate seems determined to crush you? Our story begins with the original radical, the man who dared to challenge the very foundation of Athenian identity, Socrates. Not the gentle, bearded sage of the schoolbooks, but a terrifying, hypnotic warrior of logic, a street-level menace to the establishment,
who walked barefoot through the dirt of the agora, destroying the reputations of the most powerful men in Greece with nothing but a well-placed question.
He was the human equivalent of an earthquake, and the Athenian elite recognized the danger instantly. Socrates wasn't just teaching young men. He was installing mental operating systems designed to resist indoctrination, to question authority, and to utterly reject the comfortable lies that held their society together. His method, the relentless, surgical interrogation known as the Socratic method, was a direct threat to every politician, every priest, and every general who relied on ignorance and obedience to maintain their grasp on power. The city was still reeling from a catastrophic military defeat, the horrific trauma of the Peloponnesian War, where democracy had utterly failed and been replaced by a savage oligarchy. The Athenians were paranoid, vengeful, and searching for a scapegoat large enough to carry the weight of their failure. And there he was, Socrates, the gadfly, the intellectual terrorist who refused to be silent. His refusal to conform, his insistence on radical self-examination, was interpreted not as wisdom, but as treason, a psychic virus infecting the youth and undermining the state's desperate attempt at recovery. Can you imagine the pressure, the fear? His students were being hunted, his friends were being executed, and the entire weight of a traumatized city was focusing its toxic gaze solely upon him. This was not a philosophy lecture. This was a high-stakes geopolitical drama playing out in a public square. The charges leveled against him were flimsy on the surface, designed purely for public consumption, impiety and corrupting the youth. But the real, terrifying accusation was this: Socrates was teaching people how to be fundamentally free, and a truly free person cannot be governed, cannot be controlled, and certainly cannot be silenced. The court case that followed was not a pursuit of justice. It was a desperate attempt by a collapsing empire to kill an idea before it spread too far and became unstoppable. They demanded conformity, but Socrates offered something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous: absolute, internal sovereignty. He stood before 500 of his peers, facing a guaranteed death sentence. Yet his demeanor was not one of panic or pleading, but of amused, total detachment. The calmness he displayed was so profound, so absolute, that it infuriated his accusers more than any defense possibly could have. He was proving, right there in the shadow of the Acropolis, that the external world, its laws, its judgments, its threats of execution, held zero power over a mind that had mastered itself. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the moment the true saga of ancient wisdom begins. It is the moment we realize that philosophy is not a parlor game for academics. It is the ultimate weapon against the crushing, inevitable brutality of existence. They were about to learn that you can kill the man, but the wisdom, once set free, becomes an immortal, unstoppable force that will echo through the millennia, challenging every tyrant and saving every desperate soul who dares to listen. This is the story of how a small group of thinkers saved civilization, not by fighting, but by mastering the terrifying art of inner calm.
The shadow of the tyrant, the smell of fear, the legions marching not for conquest, but for suppression. This was the air the philosophers breathed. Rome, the supposed eternal city, had become a pressure cooker, a grand marble asylum where the price of a wrong look was your head on a spike. The halls of power were slick with betrayal, and the moment a Caesar felt his ego pricked, the purge would begin, sweeping away senators, poets, and anyone whose independent thought suggested a lack of absolute servitude. But even the brutal whim of a Nero or a Caligula paled in comparison to the true enemy that swept across the known world, the great mortality. The Antonine Plague, a terror unleashed by legions returning from the East in 165 AD, didn't just kill, it erased entire cities, leaving behind streets paved with corpses and the silence of absolute dread. This was not a localized outbreak. This was a biological apocalypse that historians estimate wiped out nearly a third of the population in some areas, collapsing the economy and shattering the already fragile social contract. Fear was a currency, traded in hushed whispers and desperate prayers to forgotten gods. Priests abandoned their temples, doctors fled their patients. The rule of law disintegrated into cannibalistic self-preservation. When your neighbor's fever could be your death sentence, trust became a fatal weakness, and panic was the only reliable instinct. Yet, in the very heart of this maelstrom, amidst the pyres burning constantly on the outskirts of the city, there were those who walked with a terrifying, unnatural composure. They were the Stoics, and their calm was not born of denial, but of brutal, logical acceptance. They didn't pray for the plague to end. They studied its relentless mechanism. They didn't run from the suffering. They ran towards the epicenter of human need, armed with nothing but a principle. This was not naive bravery. This was a deep, calculated understanding of fate itself. They had already internalized the absolute certainty of death long before the disease arrived, making them the only truly free men left alive. They alone understood the radical difference between what is external and what is internal. Imagine Epicurus, the former slave, teaching his students while the screams of the dying echoed through the porticos. He would look them in the eye, his gaze steady as bedrock, and ask the impossible question: what is truly yours? Not your wealth, for the tyrant can seize it. Not your body, for the plague can consume it. Only your judgment, your perception, your inner citadel. This inner citadel was not some ethereal concept invented for pleasant debate. It was a hardened, psychological bunker, built stone by painful stone, designed to withstand the siege of destiny. Every time a student worried about impending execution or the loss of their child, Epicurus forced them to rehearse the catastrophe. To rehearse the worst possible outcome,
not to wallow in it, but to strip it of its unexpected, paralyzing power. They were training for psychological warfare against destiny, mastering the terrifying skill of indifference to external disaster. This training was so potent, so psychologically liberating, that it rendered the practitioners functionally immune to the primary tools of both disease and despotism. They removed the element of surprise from suffering.
The emperors, with all their legions, feared these men more than any barbarian horde. They understood power, and the philosopher who truly mastered the Stoic discipline was fundamentally immune to the emperor's greatest tool, fear.
How do you threaten a man who has already internalized and accepted the loss of everything? His family, his fortune, his freedom, his very life. You cannot blackmail a person who knows that even his breath is merely a temporary loan from the universe. Consider Lucius Annaeus Seneca, advisor to the monstrous young Nero, a man whose eloquence shaped the empire and whose wealth was legendary. Seneca knew the game was rigged. He knew that the moment Nero felt threatened, the philosopher's ticket would be punched. When the order came for his forced suicide, the ultimate violation of autonomy, Seneca did not weep, did not beg, and did not rage against the injustice of a premature death. He simply asked for time to write his final letters, administering his own death with the precision of a scholar completing a difficult equation. His wife, Paulina, attempted to die with him, an act of romantic, defiant loyalty. Seneca, with his extraordinary calm, ordered the attendants to stop her bleeding, insisting that his death was sufficient sacrifice, and that she must live to bear witness to the power of philosophy. He calmly slit his veins in a warm bath, dictating timeless truths even as his lifeblood flowed into the water. This was the ultimate demonstration. The body dies, but the mind, if properly trained, remains sovereign until the final breath. They weren't just practicing philosophy. They were practicing how to die well, which meant they finally knew how to live. And this forbidden knowledge, this terrifying serenity, was about to be weaponized against the crushing weight of the ancient world. This philosophical resilience, forged in the twin fires of plague and political terror, was the silent weapon that would eventually undermine the very foundations of the tyranny that sought to crush it, setting the stage for an intellectual uprising the world had never seen. The intellectual uprising was brewing, yes, but the battlefield was not some gilded Senate floor. It was the infected alleyways of Rome, where death walked openly, wearing the mask of the Antonine Plague. Imagine a city of 1,000,000 souls, the beating heart of the known world, suddenly choked by an invisible enemy, an enemy that turned the mighty Roman legions, the unbreakable hammer of Mars, into shivering, delirious casualties. The returning soldiers, fresh from the Parthian front,
did not bring spoils and glory. They brought contagion, a viral wildfire that started in the east and consumed everything it touched, spreading faster than Caesar's fastest courier could ride.
This was not just sickness. This was the undoing of order. The streets, once bustling with commerce and power, became rivers of corpses, piled high because the living had neither the strength nor the will to bury the dead properly. Fear, a raw primal scream, replaced law. Looting was rampant. Priests abandoned their temples. Even the most hardened centurions found themselves begging for mercy from a fate they suddenly realized they couldn't control. The infrastructure of the sprawling empire, the roads, the granaries, the very machinery of governance, began to seize up, grinding to a halt under the weight of sheer human loss. The crisis was so profound that even gold lost its luster. What good was wealth when the only certainty was the grave? The external world had achieved maximum chaos. This was the fire that was meant to burn away all soft idealism, leaving only hardened, terrified survivors. This was the moment the philosophers were meant to break, to abandon their abstract principles and join the universal wailing. But look closely, deep within the city, beyond the smoke of the burning funeral pyres, and you find a singular, terrifying anomaly. Men and women sitting quietly amidst the ruin, breathing the same lethal air, yet untouched by the madness. They were not wealthy. They did not possess powerful guards or magical amulets. Their only defense was a mind meticulously trained against the storm, a fortress built not of stone, but of logic and acceptance. While others screamed at the gods, demanding answers the heavens would not provide, they focused intensely on the one thing the plague could not steal: their internal assent, their judgment. The true battle, they taught, was never against the virus itself, but against the fear of the virus. The physical body might fail, but the internal commander, the ruling principle, that must remain sovereign, untainted by panic. This was the ultimate, bloody test of their wisdom. Could the abstract lessons learned in quiet lecture halls survive the stench of death and the rattle of the dying? The answer was a resounding, revolutionary yes. When the city magistrates panicked and fled to their country villas, these philosophers, these dangerous radicals of the mind, did the unthinkable. They stayed. They walked directly into the plague hospitals, if you could even call the makeshift, horrifying wards that, and offered the only true comfort available. They did not promise miraculous cures or divine intervention. They offered perspective. They showed the dying how to face their last breath with dignity, reminding them that the event of death was simply the cessation of sensation, an inevitable consequence of existing. This calm was not passivity. It was active resistance against the internal tyranny of panic. Imagine the scene.
a man racked by fever, his skin erupting in black pustules, screaming for water, and a philosopher simply holds his hand, speaking not of hope, but of nature and duty.
And in that moment of shared, raw humanity, something transformative happened. The dying man, finding a shred of peace in the face of inevitable destruction, became a sudden, powerful witness to the power of the controlled mind. Even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the man who held the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, was not immune to the existential dread. He watched his legions decimated, his treasury drained, and the philosophical wisdom he championed tested to its absolute breaking point. He was, by all accounts, a man of profound discipline, yet the sheer scale of the catastrophe, the losses mounting into the millions, perhaps a third of the empire, threatened to shatter even his iron resolve. His diary entries, snatched glimpses into the soul of a ruler under siege, reveal the agonizing truth. Power offered no shield against fate, and wealth bought no antidote to suffering. He watched his own children fall ill, confronting mortality in the most intimate way possible. He was forced to confront the ultimate philosophical paradox. If everything is indifferent, why bother ruling? Why fight the chaos? Why not simply let the empire collapse into the abyss? The answer lay in the duty, the logos itself. The philosopher must act, not because he expects a reward or a guaranteed outcome, but because the action itself is right, regardless of the chaos surrounding it. This commitment kept the empire from completely disintegrating. This quiet, unflappable commitment to duty amidst the plague became the most radical political statement of the age. It demonstrated, without firing a single arrow, that true power did not reside in the purple robes of the emperor, nor in the blades of the Praetorian Guard. It resided in the mind's ability to stand apart from its circumstances. When the empire was failing, the philosophical school was thriving, attracting the disillusioned, the broken, the survivors who needed not blind faith, but undeniable certainty and mental fortitude. Their wisdom was not a retreat from the world. It was the only viable strategy for engaging with a world determined to self-destruct. The calmness was not a luxury. It was the ultimate necessary weapon against extinction, proving that the philosophical life was the highest form of resistance. The terror had peaked, and in the ashes of the great pandemic, the true immortal power of philosophy was finally revealed, ready to spread through the empire like a benevolent counterplague of reason, preparing the populace for the inevitable return of tyrannical rule. The brief, glorious dawn of reason was suddenly, violently extinguished. We had believed that the benevolent counterplague of wisdom had inoculated the empire against external madness forever. But the universe proved that even philosophy has limits against overwhelming biological horror. The great philosophical movement that had swept through the legions and the libraries
was about to face its most terrifying examination. Not a test of logic, but a trial by fire, pestilence, and the absolute return of uncontrolled primal tyranny. The fragility of human achievement was laid bare as the very ground beneath Rome began to shudder, not from an earthquake, but from the synchronized collapse of order. The legions returning from border wars brought more than just victory parades. They were carriers of a resurrected nightmare. The Antonine Plague, which had temporarily retreated, now surged back with a virulence that suggested it had studied human immunity and learned how to laugh at our feeble attempts to contain it. Imagine the despair. Those who survived the first wave now had to watch their children succumb to the second, knowing that their survival was merely a delay, not an escape. The serene porticos where Epicurus's lessons on acceptance were once delivered became triage zones, makeshift hospitals where the only real treatment was the acceptance of inevitable fate. This was the moment when the practical, deadly serious nature of Stoicism separated the true adherents from the intellectual tourists. Anyone can talk about controlling perceptions in a peaceful villa, but can you maintain indifference to things outside your control, when those things are literally suffocating the life out of your family? The world demanded that the philosophers break, that they scream, that they join the panicked looting that consumed every major city from Alexandria to the Rhine. But they did not. They doubled down on their internal fortress, turning their disciplined minds towards service, not panic. They understood that their greatest contribution was not curing the plague, but preventing the psychological contagion of mass hysteria. A mind fortified by reason, even facing certain death, remained a beacon of structure in a universe dissolving into chaos. Yet, as the physical defenses of the empire crumbled under the weight of disease and dwindling manpower, the political structure offered no relief. Instead, it delivered the ultimate human terror, the descent into total, unreasoning despotism. The long, silent shadow of Commodus, the supposed heir of the great philosopher-king Marcus Aurelius, finally manifested as a blinding, horrifying reality. He was not just a bad ruler. He was the living embodiment of unbridled ego, a creature who saw the entire Roman world as his personal, bloody circus. While the philosophers taught the virtue of humility and self-control, Commodus was demanding to be worshipped as Hercules, fighting gladiators in the arena and making sport of executing high-ranking senators for the slightest perceived slight. The external chaos was now perfectly mirrored by the internal chaos of the palace. The Stoics, who preached the duty of citizenship, were caught in an impossible bind. How do you serve a state whose ruler is actively trying to dismantle all reason and morality? Their texts, which spoke of natural law and cosmic order, were suddenly revolutionary manifestos against a regime that embraced the unnatural and the disorderly. This forced a subtle but profound shift in their methodology. They moved from grand public lectures on civic virtue to hidden, clandestine teaching, knowing that survival now depended not on convincing the tyrant, but on equipping the populace to endure his madness. Sextus Empiricus, the relentless skeptic, found his moment of terrible relevance. When the emperor claims divinity and his decrees defy reality, the ability to question everything becomes the single most potent form of intellectual rebellion. Doubt was the new armor. They taught the people that the emperor could seize your property, he could destroy your body, but he could never, under any circumstances, control your judgment of his actions. This profound internal defiance, this refusal to grant the tyrant power over the mind, was their last desperate strategy. They became the silent architects of psychological resilience, preparing the city not just for the next wave of disease, but for the prolonged nightmare of living under a madman's rule. They proved that true philosophical power was not found in ivory towers, but deep in the trenches of human suffering. It was a war fought not with steel or legions, but with syllogisms and the iron discipline of attention, ensuring that when the empire finally hit rock bottom, there would still be minds sharp enough and souls calm enough to rebuild the ruins of civilization. The discipline wasn't just for dusty debates. It was a fire shield against the inevitable catastrophic failure of the machine known as the Roman Empire, a system they knew was inherently unstable and destined for glorious, terrifying ruin. They knew the Golden Age was a lie. When the legions, returning triumphant but tainted from their campaigns in the East, brought back more than just spoils, when they delivered the invisible, relentless assassin known as the Antonine Plague, the veneer cracked instantly, revealing the sheer, shrieking terror underneath the civilized world. This was not merely sickness. This was existential, demographic collapse, an enemy that bypassed the legions and attacked the very concept of community, turning neighbors into carriers and crowded markets into mass graves. Imagine the streets of Rome, once the proud arteries of the world, now choked with perpetual funeral pyres, the smoke so thick it blotted out the midday sun, a choking, acrid reminder of death's total, undisputed victory. Up to 2,000 people were dying every single day in the capital alone, a statistical annihilation that should have collapsed the entire infrastructure in mere weeks, turning the great city into a silent, festering monument of despair. The common man, stripped of reason by overwhelming fear and the pervasive stench of mortality, turned instantly to frenzied superstition, blaming foreign gods, domestic enemies, and whispering dark, venomous curses into the night air. Priests were overwhelmed and useless. Doctors offered barbaric, useless treatments, and the emperors themselves were locked in a desperate, failing battle against an invisible enemy that cared nothing for their purple robes or their legions of silver-plated soldiers. But while the world dissolved into raw, primal hysteria, the philosophers did not run. They did not retreat to luxurious villas to wait out the biological storm, hoping the fates would pass them over in their comfortable, isolated chambers. Instead, they walked straight into the contagion zone, moving with a chilling, almost unnatural composure, armed not with worthless medicine or rituals, but with something far more lethal to panic: radical acceptance and unwavering commitment to duty. This was the proving ground for their entire philosophy, the final exam of their spiritual engineering. If their discipline was real, if their tranquility was genuine, it had to hold when the breath of death was literally on their necks, when the sick lay moaning in pools of their own effluvium, demanding aid they could barely offer. They understood the great division, the dichotomy of control. They could not control the virus's path, the mutation rate, or the emperor's inevitable despair. But they could absolutely control their judgment, their immediate response, and their commitment to the remaining flickering embers of humanity surrounding them, refusing to surrender their inner citadel to the external calamity. Consider the greatest of them all, the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius himself, sitting squarely at the center of this collapsing vortex. While the empire was being simultaneously consumed by plague in the south and barbarian hordes pressing relentlessly in the north, he was not paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster, nor did he indulge in self-pity or cosmic lamentation. Instead, he systematically applied the principles he had painstakingly learned in the quiet of his youth, treating the global collapse not as a metaphysical horror, but as a colossal, urgent operational problem that demanded cold, calculating logic and immediate action. His journal entries, the legendary Meditations, written during these very years of unimaginable stress and death, are conspicuously not filled with fear or despair. They are filled with stark, powerful reminders to himself about justice, duty, and the temporary, indifferent nature of all external things, including life itself. He was rehearsing his own death while organizing the survival of millions, a feat of mental stamina that defies modern comprehension. This wasn't just about passively reading a scroll or nodding sagely at a lecture. This was about the ultimate, extreme mental martial art, a constant wrestling match against the primal dictates of self-preservation. Every time they encountered a dying man whose eyes held nothing but confusion and terror, every time they smelled the metallic, sweet scent of sickness and decay, their internal system screamed, "Flee, abandon ship." But they held the line, maintaining their position like the Praetorian Guard defending the sacred standards of Rome. They utilized the ancient techniques of attention, the relentless, surgical prosopche, to instantaneously filter out the raw, terrifying sensory data and focus only on the required immediate action. Fetch clean water. offer the comfort of a steady gaze, organize the dignified burial of the fallen. It was the absolute highest test of the Stoic premise that the only true good is virtue, and that virtue remains perfectly accessible even when the entire physical world is burning down around you, even when your own body is threatening to fail you and deliver you to the feverish endpoint. They were performing the spiritual equivalent of emergency surgery on a dying civilization, using only their minds as scalpels, cutting away the pervasive panic and the unreasonable, destructive demands of paralyzing fear. The result was nothing short of astonishing and dramatically life-saving. While government bureaucracies fractured under the pressure, and religious zealots cannibalized the social structure with absurd fear-mongering pronouncements, the philosophical networks provided solid, unshakable islands of sanity.
They organized coordinated relief efforts, ensured administrative continuity, and demonstrated a standard of unflappable, rational conduct that gave everyone else something tangible, concrete, and deeply reassuring to cling to amidst the madness. Their calm wasn't accidental or innate. It was rigorously engineered over decades of punishing mental training.
It was the final, undeniable proof that the highest wisdom was not merely theoretical, but was, in fact, the most robust, dependable, and efficient survival mechanism ever devised by the human spirit, ensuring that the critical seeds of reason, even in the deepest biological winter of the collapsing empire, were securely planted for the inevitable, brutal spring of renewal. They survived the devastating biological storm, only to find the geopolitical storm gathering even greater, more terrifying strength on the frozen, hostile banks of the Danube, demanding an even greater, more terrifying application of their legendary and inexplicable calm. The ice didn't just hold the Danube, it became the bridge for the nightmare. The northern horde, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians, were not just soldiers, they were a freezing tsunami of desperation, driven by deeper, colder forces than Rome had ever faced. They didn't just cross the border, they shattered it, grinding the very concept of the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, into dust under the weight of iron-shod hooves and screaming war cries that echoed down into the Italian plain itself. But even as the alarm screamed from the frozen fields of Pannonia to the ancient streets of Rome, a quieter, more insidious enemy was already devouring the heart of the empire. This was the mors nigra of the ancient world, the Antonine Plague, a biological terror so absolute it made the barbarian sword look merciful. It was an unseen enemy, a creeping catastrophe that defied legions and diplomacy alike. Rumor held that the contagion was released by careless legionaries who, during the Parthian campaign, had violated a cursed golden casket in the Temple of Apollo in Seleucia, unleashing a cosmic punishment upon the arrogant empire. A myth, perhaps, but the reality was a tidal wave of death. Fever, black pustules, bloody diarrhea, and a demise so swift that entire families were found cold, still seated at their dinner tables, their final meals uneaten. This wasn't war. This was the universe actively trying to reset itself, demanding a psychological fortitude from the few remaining leaders that defied human comprehension. Enter Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the burdened student of Epicurus, the man who carried the weight of the meditations, not in a quiet library, but in a freezing, mud-caked campaign tent on the unforgiving Austrian frontier. He was facing two existential fronts: the screaming chaos of the barbarian advance that threatened to sack Aquileia, the gateway to Italy, and the silent, agonizing betrayal of his own body politic, decimated by the disease which killed up to 2,000 people a day in Rome alone. How does Stoicism handle millions of dead citizens? How does serenity survive when the imperial treasury is empty? The legions are decimated by illness, and the very structure of civilization is melting like ice in the spring sun. The pressure on Marcus was not merely political or military. It was purely, terrifyingly existential. Every breath he took, every measured instruction he gave, was an act of profound philosophical defiance against total civil collapse. His generals were panicking, sacrificing oxen by the hundreds, begging the gods for miraculous intervention to stem the flow of blood and disease. But Marcus knew the true battleground was not in the heavens, but within the skull. He sold off the imperial silver, the palace jewels, the entire contents of the imperial storerooms, and even the Empress Faustina's luxurious wardrobe, not just to raise funds for the immediate war effort, but to maintain the dignitas of the state, an act of supreme, almost unthinkable detachment from material vanity in the face of ruin. The common man, engulfed by terror and grief, saw this calm, this measured response to apocalypse, and they didn't see virtue. They saw an unsettling, unnatural coldness. They whispered that the philosophers had a secret, an esoteric ritual, a hidden pact that allowed them to cheat fear and guarantee their tranquility while the world burned around them, viewing their peace as a form of dark, occult magic. But the Stoic secret, the core mechanism that allowed them to function amid the biological and military carnage, was far more terrifying, far more demanding than any potion or spell. It was the deliberate, surgical removal of the future. They didn't suppress fear. They starved it by refusing to acknowledge tomorrow or even the next hour, accepting the inevitability of suffering and death with radical, clinical realism. Everything external, health, wealth, reputation, the survival of Rome itself, the breath in their lungs, was meticulously designated as adiaphora, indifferent things that should not influence the rational mind. Imagine the sheer, inhuman discipline required to stand on a mud-caked battlefield, watching your entire regiment cough up blood and die in agonizing spasms, and then consciously choosing to focus only on the precise execution of the next command, the perfectly timed step, the single virtuous thought of this exact moment.
They were living minute to minute, but achieving a state of timelessness, a profound psychological victory over time itself. Even the greatest medical mind of the age, Galen of Pergamon, confessed his helplessness against the plague, fleeing Rome temporarily in absolute terror to his homeland. But the philosophers stayed. Not out of common bravery, but because fleeing was an external action that would betray the internal commitment to duty. The Epicureans, often mocked as mere seekers of pleasure, showed their true mettle here too. They did not retreat to gardens of luxury. They faced the inevitable with a serene acceptance that eliminated the pain of anticipation. Their goal was ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, which they found not by ignoring suffering, but by accepting its temporary, transient nature. They treated life as a single, finite feast, savoring the present moment, even as the shadow of death stretched long across the table, and the invisible enemy stalked their homes. This refusal to flinch, this steadfast, unblinking gaze into the abyss of chaos, was the true spectacle, the great performance of internal strength. It forced the barbarians, who relied on psychological terror and chaos to break the legions, into confusion. How do you truly defeat an enemy whose internal citadel has already accepted death, whose emotional reserves are completely insulated from the terror you wield, whose deepest fear has already been rationalized away? The chaos only deepened. The Marcomanni coalition demanded tribute, vast parcels of land, and the right to settle permanently within the sacred borders of the empire, effectively demanding the surrender of Roman identity. Yet the philosopher emperor, standing amid the wreckage, refused to compromise his core philosophical principles of justice and duty. He would rebuild the shattered legions, not just with the gold he sold, but with the moral authority derived from his unflattable demeanor, demanding duty, not promising easy victory. The storm had engulfed the world, yes, but the light of philosophical resilience, burning hotter and brighter than any legionary torch, was focused now entirely on the terrifying final pushback across the Danube. This was not merely war. It was the ultimate cosmic proving ground for the human soul, the definitive test of the Stoic ideal. The stakes were now infinite. The survival of the West depended entirely on whether a man could maintain absolute clarity and detachment, while standing knee-deep in the biological and military wreckage of his own collapsing civilization. And the world held its breath, waiting to see if philosophy could truly triumph over the apocalypse. The breath held by the ancient world was not just held, it was shattering. The wreckage surrounding the philosophers wasn't merely physical, it was the profound wreckage of human belief itself. How could a man, a literal god-emperor, watch his legions dissolve into pus and fever, watch the greatest civilization ever constructed buckle under the weight of biological terror,
while maintaining the measured, quiet tone of a scholar debating geometry. This wasn't just calm. This was psychological warfare waged against reality, and the stakes were the survival of the human spirit. The specific terror that stalked the halls of the empire now had a name, though they didn't know its nature: the Antonine Plague. It was a biblical scourge, an unseen, microscopic killer that rode back with the victorious, but fatally infected, legions returning from the east. It was the ultimate Trojan horse, spreading from military camps into the heart of Rome's teeming slums, infecting the great marble palaces, and eventually touching the very lifeblood of the ruling elite. The death toll was not just high, it was apocalyptic. Historians estimate that in some regions, perhaps a quarter of the population was simply erased from existence, shattering the foundation of the Pax Romana and throwing the entire economic and social structure into a death spiral. Imagine Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, sitting in his chambers, trying to administer justice when the sky outside was permanently veiled by the smoke of countless funeral pyres. Inside, his most trusted advisors, his most capable generals, his own children were dropping dead, not by the expected political assassination, but by an invisible terror that mocked all military might and political calculation. He wasn't just dealing with death. He was dealing with the corrosive, meaningless death that threatened to make the entire imperial project, the glorious legacy of Rome, utterly pointless. The common people, gripped by raw instinctual hysteria, reverted instantly to primal fear. They sacrificed thousands of oxen in futile attempts to appease angry gods. They consulted dark, nonsensical oracles. They frantically sought scapegoats, turning on Christians, foreigners, anyone who seemed vulnerable or different. Panic became an epidemic more lethal than the disease itself.
But Marcus Aurelius, he didn't build bigger temples to beg for salvation. He didn't engage in mass persecutions driven by fear. He retreated, not from duty, but into his scrolls. He sat down amidst the stench of death and the clamor of panic, and he anchored himself to the single, terrifyingly simple truth that formed the cornerstone of his Stoic defense. The plague was an external event. This was not denial of the horror. This was the ultimate, cold-blooded acceptance. He recognized a pain, acknowledged the profound tragedy, but this was not denial of the horror. This was the ultimate, cold-blooded acceptance. He recognized a pain, acknowledged the profound tragedy, but he refused to let the external circumstances, no matter how cataclysmic, dictate his internal landscape, his prohairesis. He used the plague, the ultimate external terror, as a savage, high-stakes training exercise. Every cough, every collapsed colleague, every cart rattling past filled with corpses was a stark reminder of the utter fragility of the body and the world, and therefore the absolute necessity of focusing all energy on the only thing he truly controlled, his moral judgment and his reason. It was an intellectual fortress against biological meltdown. While superstitious priests screamed incantations and doctors fled in terror, often spreading the contagion further by their desperate flight, Marcus systematically addressed the logistical collapse with terrifying efficiency. He made decisions based purely on rational utility, divorced from emotion. He sold off imperial treasures, silks, gold goblets, precious artifacts, even his wife Faustina's immensely extravagant jewelry, not to finance lavish new wars, but simply to manage the overwhelming relief effort and pay for burial costs so the dead wouldn't rot in the streets. He monetized the entire history of Rome's grandeur just to keep the city from cannibalizing itself under the pressure of sickness. And as if the biological nightmare wasn't enough to drive any mortal man to madness, the northern frontier, the mighty Danube river line, began to buckle and crack. Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the terrifying Yazidis, saw Rome's staggering weakness, smelled the sickness and the desperation, and poured across the river in a relentless, terrifying deluge of barbarism. Rome was instantaneously fighting a deadly, high-stakes war on two fronts. One against an unstoppable, invisible microorganism that targeted the soul, and the other against relentless human invaders who wanted nothing more than to burn the empire to ash and take the land. The pressure was unthinkable. This is where the legend of the philosopher-warrior truly crystallized into myth. Marcus didn't stay cloistered in Rome. He packed up his scrolls, traded the luxurious purple robes for a soldier's plain armor, and marched north, directly into the freezing, disease-ridden chaos of the military frontier. He willingly chose to live for years in a muddy tent, enduring the same extreme cold, the same abysmal conditions, and the same paralyzing fear as the lowest legionary. And it was there, in the bitter, cold wilderness, constantly facing the threat of death by plague or by axe, that he simultaneously wrote the most profound, calm, and resilient meditations on human existence ever conceived. The contrast was a staggering testament to the power of the mind.
How the soldiers must have wondered, do you write about the virtues of temperance and cosmic justice when your canvas is a freezing, rain-soaked tent, and the background music is the screams of men being butchered by Gothic axes? Because for the Stoic, the external physical battle was utterly irrelevant to the internal moral one.
The cold was merely a sensation. The threat of instant death was merely an inevitable future event, not something to be feared now. The true, unforgivable loss would have been abandoning his duty, allowing fear or despair to corrupt his reason, or allowing the chaos of the world to dictate his character. Marcus Aurelius was not just surviving the collapse of his world. He was demonstrating a profound metaphysical superiority over it. He was proving that the mind, trained correctly in the unforgiving discipline of Stoicism, was literally impervious to the worst realities the universe could throw at it. Therefore, the barbarians thought they were fighting Rome. They were actually fighting an abstract, weaponized philosophy. A calm so deep, it felt less human, and more like the unyielding, unmovable bedrock of the earth itself. The question remained, a question that hung heavy over every freezing camp and plague-ridden city. Could this impossible calm hold? Or would the combined, crushing weight of plague, war, and famine finally shatter the philosopher king? The whisper started far away, carried on the spoiled winds from the eastern campaigns, a sound more chilling than the clanging of Sarmatian shields. It wasn't just death that arrived. It was a biological weapon, unseen and utterly relentless, ripping through the Ninth Legion like fire through dry reeds. The dreaded Antonine Plague, the very pestilence Marcus Aurelius had dedicated his life to mitigating, had breached the imperial defenses, not just at the borders, but right into the very heart of the capital's command structure. This was the moment the ancient world held its breath, waiting for the emperor, the living embodiment of Stoic resilience, to finally crack under the unbearable pressure. The official death counts became meaningless, a useless formality, replaced by the constant, choking smell of burning pyres that stained the Roman sky permanently brown. Galen, the empire's greatest physician, was documenting symptoms that defied logic. Severe diarrhea, violent vomiting, and skin eruptions so black they resembled volcanic ash, leading soldiers to call it the shadow skin. Every third man in a cohort was falling, not to the Parthian sword, but to an invisible, microscopic assassin. The legions were desertifying. Fear, the great destabilizer, was doing what no barbarian army ever could, dissolving the empire from within its own terrified ranks. And yet, in the center of this screaming maelstrom, there was the emperor. Marcus Aurelius did not barricade himself away. He walked among the dying, his face a mask of resolute tranquility, studying the contagion not with panic, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a natural philosopher. He refused the easy escape of superstition. While priests sacrificed thousands of animals and charlatans peddled useless amulets, the emperor sat down, not to pray, but to write, documenting his internal landscape, while the external world burned around him. His meditations were not a luxurious pastime. They were the essential armor, the heavy chainmail of the mind, forged in the fire of continuous, unimaginable crisis. He knew the goal was not to survive the plague, but to survive the fear of the plague, the psychological contagion that was far deadlier than the virus itself. The financial strain became monstrous. As the plague annihilated the tax base and demand for war supplies soared, the imperial treasury began to bleed dry. Senators, seeing the end of the world approaching, started hoarding grain and melting down public statues for personal profit, ready to flee the capital at the slightest provocation.
preparing their villas in distant Sicily for the inevitable collapse. Marcus Aurelius faced a profound choice: debase the currency entirely, guaranteeing hyperinflation and economic ruin for the common citizen, or impose draconian, unpopular taxes on the already suffering populace. He chose the unprecedented, dangerous path, one that shocked the established order to its core.
He began selling off the imperial jewels, the gold-threaded tapestries, the opulent furniture, and even the empress's personal collection of pearls and gold plate in a massive public auction held over 2 months in the Forum. The emperor was literally liquidating the symbols of his power just to keep the legions fed and the city operational. This move, though necessary, sent shockwaves of disbelief through the elite. They saw weakness. The common man saw a stark, terrifying sacrifice. "The emperor sells his crowns to buy us bread," the street vendors whispered, the ultimate sign that the crisis was truly existential, that they were living on borrowed time, bought with the historical treasures of Rome. But the external pressure was designed to break the man, not just the throne. The constant, brutal weight of managing 2 concurrent wars, the plague and the Marcomannic conflicts, began to etch deep lines of exhaustion into the emperor's face, lines that even his disciplined spirit could not completely erase, signs of the mortal man beneath the philosophical armor. He was sleeping only 2 hours a night, waking up to fresh reports of mass graves and barbarian raids hitting the Danubian frontier simultaneously. His inner circle, dedicated Stoics themselves, watched with growing dread, seeing the physical strain demanding payment for the internal calm he maintained. They knew the theory of apathy, the philosophical detachment, but they also saw the physical body failing under the strain of holding up the entire world. His personal physician warned him constantly, "Your Majesty, the body is a temple of the soul, but it is not made of iron. You must rest, or the philosophy will not save the flesh." But rest was a luxury the sinking ship of the empire could not afford, and the emperor considered his duty to the state superior to his own biological needs. Every decision became a moral agony, a razor's edge walk between tradition and necessity. Should he conscript slaves, breaking ancient traditions of the Roman military to fill the depleted ranks? Should he allow the gladiators, trained killers and condemned men to join the army, thus emptying the very arenas that kept the desperate populace entertained and distracted from the crushing reality? He chose the ruthless expediency, authorizing the enrollment of slaves and mercenaries, a move that his ancestors would have considered treasonous, demonstrating how utterly bankrupt the crisis had made the traditional Roman military structure. The true, terrifying secret of his calm was not that he felt nothing, but that he felt everything, processed the grief and the dread instantly, and refused to let the raw emotion manifest as chaotic action. He was a perfect cognitive machine, a human computer running on pure logic while surrounded by emotional fire, a beacon of reason in a darkening age.
He wrote about the impermanence of all things, even the empire itself, reminding himself that if the universe wished for Rome to end, then Rome must end with dignity and philosophical grace. This was the ultimate, radical acceptance, the final surrender to fate that paradoxically gave him complete control over his response.
This philosophy was not just a shield, it was a deadly weapon, turning the arrows of fortune into simple, inert facts. But fate, ever the cruel playwright, was preparing its final, most devastating act, one designed to test the limits of even his transcendent wisdom. The reports came in from the north, confirming the worst intelligence. The Quadi and the Marcomanni, seeing Rome's weakness, seeing the legions crippled by disease, were uniting into a massive, unstoppable force, preparing for the final, decisive invasion across the frozen Danube. The entire frontier, the fragile line between civilization and the howling wilderness, was about to collapse. Marcus Aurelius knew he could not send his weakened, plague-ridden legions without their commander. He had to go himself, the philosopher king marching. Marcus Aurelius knew he could not send his weakened, plague-ridden legions without their commander. He had to go himself, the philosopher king marching into the apocalyptic winter, carrying the weight of the entire Western world on his shoulders, facing enemies external and internal, all while fighting the black shadow of the invisible plague that stalked his every step and threatened to claim him at any moment.
The stage was set for a final siege that would either immortalize him as the greatest Roman or witness the final, spectacular crash of the ancient world's last great hope, a collapse heralded not by war cries, but by the cough of a microscopic enemy.
The cough was no longer a herald. It was the drumbeat of the apocalypse. It had swallowed the armies of the East, decimated the legions returning victorious from Parthia, and now, like a hungry, invisible hydra, it coiled around the Palatine Hill itself, choking the very heart of the Roman Empire. This was the Antonine Plague, a biological weapon far more effective than any barbarian axe, tearing through the population with the speed of wildfire and the cruelty of a vengeful god.
The historians of the time whispered of 2,000 deaths a day in Rome alone. Imagine the density of that suffering, a city designed for glory suddenly becoming a massive open-air tomb, where the living were too terrified to mourn the dead, and the priests refused to touch the contaminated pyres. The streets, usually choked with the bustle of commerce and political intrigue, were now strangely, hauntingly silent, punctuated only by the cries of the fevered and the grinding wheels of the death carts. Yet, amidst this absolute, civilization-ending panic, there was one man who refused to buckle, whose jaw remained set against the tidal wave of suffering. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, found himself faced with a paradox that would shatter lesser men. How do you accept death as natural when death is devouring your entire society, threatening the very continuation of history.
His famous meditations were not written on comfortable parchment. They were forged in the white-hot crucible of this pestilence, amidst the stench of disease and the constant, unnerving fear that the next breath might be his last. He walked the forum, a ghost in purple, not to display bravery, for the Stoic recognizes fear, but to demonstrate duty, the central, unshakable pillar of his philosophical life. He had to be the anchor when the entire fleet was sinking. He had to be the anchor when the entire fleet was sinking. He had to remind Rome that even if the gods had abandoned them, the Logos, the divine universal reason that governed all things, had not been extinguished by a microscopic enemy, only obscured by panic. The Senate, paralyzed by superstition and terror, pleaded for divine intervention, demanding massive sacrifices to appease angry celestial powers and performing grotesque public penances. Marcus refused the theater of appeasement. His wisdom was practical, brutal, and desperately modern. He knew rituals wouldn't stop the viral spread, but doctors, sanitation, organization, and above all, rational action might buy them precious time. He emptied the imperial treasury to fund massive public works dedicated to dealing with the dead and isolating the sick, draining the vaults intended for triumphant monuments and military expansion. The gold reserved for parades of victory was now being spent on carts for bodies, a stunning inversion of imperial priority. When even that colossal fund ran dry, the unthinkable happened, a move that shocked the old aristocracy and became a legend overnight. Marcus Aurelius began to sell off the accumulated wealth of the empire, not just mundane gold, but the priceless imperial regalia, the jewels of his wife Faustina, the gilded carriages of state, and the irreplaceable art collected over generations of conquest. The auction lasted for weeks, a grotesque, somber spectacle held in the very center of the devastated city. He sold the tangible symbols of Roman invincibility, the historical vanity, to save the breathing bodies of Roman citizens. This was the true, terrifying face of Stoic leadership, the willingness to discard every vestige of personal and imperial status for the sake of functional survival, turning luxury into lifeblood. Every time a courier failed to arrive, every time a general reported a legion reduced to a quarter strength, the emperor had to return to his primary instruction. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. The insanity he fought was not just the plague's biological frenzy, but the resulting social delirium, the looting, the panicked violence, the total dissolution of societal morality, where neighbor turned against neighbor in a desperate scramble for safety. He wrote about the futility of fearing change, the inevitability of decay, and the ultimate insignificance of the individual's physical frame against the vastness of universal time, using philosophy as a firewall against despair. This wasn't cold comfort. It was a psychological weapon, designed to stabilize the terrified mind and steel the remaining hearts.
He looked at the vast, unending suffering and penned the doctrine of acceptance. A key principle of the good life is this: if we have the power to stop an evil, let us stop it. If we do not have the power, let us adjust to it. This adjustment was the hardest part. It required watching millions die, acknowledging his own limits, and still choosing to perform the duties of a king whose kingdom was literally rotting beneath his feet. The weight of Rome's survival pressed down on him, yet his soul remained impossibly unbent, like a diamond enduring the immense pressure of the earth.
But the gods of chaos were not finished testing the Stoic king's internal stability. The plague had not only killed Romans, it had utterly destabilized the frontiers, leaving vast stretches of the mighty Danube unmanned and critically undefended. The Germanic tribes, the Quadi and the Marcomanni, who had watched Rome with ancient, resentful hunger for generations, smelled the biological rot and perceived a catastrophic opportunity.
They saw not a mighty, immortal empire, but a wounded, bleeding beast collapsing under its own weight. They crossed the frozen Danube in numbers never before witnessed, sweeping down into northern Italy, burning towns, slaughtering villagers, and causing a terror that instantly added the fear of the foreign sword to the fear of the sickness within the walls.
The plague had tested his philosophy. The invasion now demanded his physical presence and his military genius. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who preferred the quiet contemplation of his library to the roaring madness of the battlefield, had to strap on his armor, leaving the diseased city behind for the frozen wastes of the north, trading the invisible enemy of the plague for the visible fury of the barbarian hordes. He was embarking on a war that would consume the remaining years of his life, a desperate conflict fought not for glory, but for the sheer, final survival of the West. His internal citadel was built. Now he had to use its strength to rebuild the very walls of the collapsing world.